Lake Seliger, Russia. Reuters. President Vladimir Putin said on Friday Russia's armed forces, backed by its nuclear arsenal, were ready to meet any aggression, declaring at a pro-Kremlin youth camp that foreign states should understand, it's best not to mess with us. Putin told the assembly, on the banks of a lake near Moscow, the Russian takeover of Crimea in March was essential to save a largely Russian-speaking population from Ukrainian government violence. He said continued fighting in eastern Ukraine, where pro-Russian separatists launched an uprising in April, was the result of a refusal by Kiev to negotiate. Ukraine and Western governments accuse Russia of sending troops and armor to back the separatists in a conflict that has already killed over 2,000 people. Russia denies the charge. Russia is far from being involved in any large-scale conflicts, he said at the camp on the banks of Lake Seliger. We don't want that and don't plan on it. But naturally, we should always be ready to repel any aggression towards Russia. Russia's partners should understand it's best not to mess with us, said Putin, dressed casually in a gray sweater and light blue jeans. Thank God, I think no one is thinking of unleashing a large-scale conflict with Russia. I want to remind you that Russia is one of the leading nuclear powers. Putin spoke easily with the students, many of whom looked to be asking scripted questions about demography and history. Other times he accepted gifts or, smilingly, played down their praise. When a student said that she had not heard a single negative comment about Putin's presidency from camp speakers, he responded with a grin that objectivity was important. His tone darkened when speaking on Ukraine, blaming the United States and the European Union for the unconstitutional removal of Kiev's former Moscow-backed president Viktor Yanukovych in replacement with a pro-European government. He said eastern Ukraine did not agree with Yanukovych's removal and was now subjected to crude military force from government planes, tanks and artillery. If those are contemporary European values, then I'm simply disappointed in the highest degree, he said, comparing Ukraine's military operations in the east of the country with the Nazi siege of Leningrad in World War II. Small villages and large cities surrounded by the Ukrainian army which is directly hitting residential areas with the aim of destroying the infrastructure. It sadly reminds me of the events of the Second World War, when German fascist occupiers surrounded our cities. The U.S. Air Force has since the end of the Second World War been regarded as the supreme air force of the world, but with its increased spending in the Middle East and the Russian military budget having increased a lot over the last 2 decades, how does the air forces look compared to each other? In this article, we will take a look into the 2 biggest air forces in the world, USAF and Russia's Air Force. US and Russia defense spending now, what can we deduce from the table? Well, first of all, we can obviously see that the US has more aircraft overall, actually more than double the amount of Russia. But why is there such a huge difference? One of the reasons is the military budget. To show this I have here a graph showing the military spending of Russia and the US over the last 22 years. Even though the graph does not exclusively show the Air Force's spending, it does show the amount of money that the US and Russia have spent on their military the last couple of years. This gives us an understanding of how much more money the US military budget consists of and is a vital ingredient to why their Air Force is the biggest one in the world. But even though the United States spends more money on its Air Force than Russia, there are a lot of things to contrast between the two. For instance, the fact that Russia has more bombers than the US is rather interesting. One of the main reasons for this is that Russia has many old bombers still in service that are cheap, instead of spending their money on new, costly projects to create the bombers of tomorrow. Russia's main bombers are still the Tupolev 95, introduced in 1956, Tupolev 160, introduced in 1981, and the Tupolev 22M, introduced in 1972. Even though many of them have been upgraded since they came in service, the cost cannot be compared to both the development cost as well as the unit cost of some of the extreme US projects like the Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit bomber. As an example, the unit cost of a Tupolev 160 is about $40 mil, while the one of the Northrop Grumman B-2 is over $2 billion each. Unit costs $737 million United States dollars. Total program cost as of 2004 $44.75 billion United States dollars with only 21 aircraft produced. The same idea goes with the fighters, but here the US really flexes its muscles by having not only more but also more expensive jet fighters than Russia has. The most recent US multi-role fighter is the Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II, first flight 2006, and the Russian is the Sukhoi 35, 2008. While the cost of the F-35 is around $125 mil, the Su-35 only cost $50 mil. So the fact that the USAF has more expensive and at the same time almost the double amount of jets than Russia has, could explain why the United States military budget is so comparatively high. Look at the table below for more information about the different concepts of the air forces. Early warning aircraft, or as many call it, eyes in the sky, are aircraft with the capability to scan the area around itself looking for incoming aircraft, like a mobile radar station. Since you usually have permanent radar stations on the ground, the early warning aircraft is only almost used with aircraft carriers and amphibious warfare ships. Because the US has 19 aircraft carriers compared to Russia's only 1, and 31 amphibious warfare ships in contrast to Russia's 2, there is an obvious reason to why the US's need of AEWACs is much greater than Russia's currently is. Transports and tankers are used by all nations, but they are obviously not used as much if the country uses a big part of its military force as a defense as if it operates a lot in another country or on another continent. Because the US maintains a world-spanning network of military bases, protects trade routes worldwide, and with the operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, they need to transport their troops and supplies great distances, which is why they have such a bigger number of transports and tankers than Russia has.
Trainers are used as can be easily figured to train pilots. There is basically only one reason why the US Air Force has so many more training aeroplanes: the extreme amount of personnel. The Russian Air Force has approximately 140,000 persons involved at the moment, while the USAF has almost 700,000. This means that the latter has to train a lot more persons and therefore needs a lot more training jets.
When we now come to the rotary wing aircraft, the reason to why the two countries have such big differences are mainly two things. The first one is that the United States use most of their helicopters as a part of the Navy, Army, and the second one is that Russia has put much more effort and money in their helicopter business, which is proven for instance by the world's heaviest lifting helicopter, the Russian Mi-26. Now to conclude this comparison, there are some things that are needed to be said. The USAF spends such enormous amounts on their military each year that it is almost impossible to compare it with another country. But since Russia has the second greatest air force in the world, there can be some conclusions drawn of how the air forces compare to each other as can be seen above. USAF's idea is to develop aeroplanes that cost a lot, while Russia instead focuses on making many cheap aircraft, just like Joseph Stalin's famous quote, "Some say it was actually used by Lenin before." This is a comparison made not to show the best air force but instead to point out what the countries have spent their money and time on and how this has shaped them into what they are today, and how surprisingly different they are when you look deeply into it. The Russia-Ukraine war has been underway for many months now, yet somehow Ukrainians have still managed to prevent an overwhelmingly larger Russian air force from achieving air superiority. Ukraine operates only 69 fighter jets and Russia has 772 fighter aircraft, an imbalance of sizable proportions, according to Global Firepower. At the same time, some might look at this numerical imbalance and wonder just how many of Russia's 772 fighter aircraft are functional, high-tech, fourth-generation Su-35s, modern fighter jets which emerged only in 2014. Ukraine operates air defenses as well, and they are weapons the Pentagon says continue to be effective against Russian air power. The Ukrainians operate a collection of Cold War-era Soviet-built SAM systems, the most recent of which is the Sa-15 Gauntlet from 1986. How much have these decades-old systems been maintained and upgraded? What kinds of additional air defenses have they been receiving? Whatever specific air defenses they have, it seems clear that they are indeed working, because a large force of Russian fighter jets, still, have not achieved air superiority. One factor which may still be informing operations is that the Russians have been described by the Pentagon as risk-averse, meaning they are less inclined to fly into areas where Ukrainian air defenses can target them. The Russians have air defenses as well, something which is a potential reason why Ukraine does not yet have air superiority either. Overall, the Russians have enough long-range, road mobile surface-to-air missile systems to cover almost the entire country of Ukraine, a scenario which raises significant unanswered questions as to why Russia has not been able to achieve air superiority. Russian S-400 air defenses, in service since 2007, have been continuously modernized with digital networking, high-speed computing and multi-frequency radar capability. This has generated an atmosphere such that state-owned Russian media reports have in recent years consistently said their air defenses could detect and destroy even stealth aircraft. Russia operates upgraded fourth-generation Su-35 aircraft as well as Su-30s and Su-35s. Both the Su-34s and Su-35s are cited as fighter aircraft, emerging as recently as 2014.